Is this his face? Is the man of the shroud the Jesus of the Gospels? Here is the shroud, with organic, blood-stained features. Biologists say it would be impossible to reduce it with a brush. On the 2,000-year-old cloth is the image of someone who was crucified. The crucifixion was carried out first by scourging, then by crowning with thorns, and finally by nailing to a cross. Instead of breaking the knees, the usual manner of execution, a spear was thrust into the right side to ensure death. This is an unusual document, with the two-sided imprint of a body with bowed head, rigid in death, resembling the Jesus of the Gospels. What could be a testimony written in blood? The sheet was used to cover a man for a determined period of time, shown by the perfect print of the blood, which then coagulated and underwent fibrinolysis, a decomposition process. Yet how an image became printed on the cloth, similar to a photographic plate, is a mystery. Scientists debate the physical-chemical mechanism which could have produced the top layer, consisting in a pale yellow image, and they cannot reproduce it. Experts think it was caused by an unknown energy. Shroud, in Latin and Greek, means burial sheet. The image also contains long, dark lines on the edges, the result of a fire at Chambéry, France, in 1532. There are small triangular patches, a lighter color made 2 years later in 1534 by Poor Clare nuns. In addition, there are smears on the shroud. After the fire was put out, water damage remained, evident on the center and at the edges of the cloth. To look at the shroud is to come face to face with a nameless corpus delicti, or the material evidence of a murder. In 1898, the first scientific discovery about the shroud was made. Photography had just been invented, and a photographer from Turin, named Secondo Pia, obtained permission to take pictures of the shroud for the first time. On the night of May 28th, Pia printed the image onto plates from the large glass negatives that were used at the time for photography, and he rushed to the dark room of his nearby studio to develop them. Pia had no idea of the surprise that awaited him that night. As he watched, he saw a change in the double impression between the actual image of the shroud, cloudy and incomprehensible, and what was being revealed on the photographic negative. For the first time, it was possible to see light and shadow effects, just as in a real photograph. The body, well proportioned and extremely distinct. The bloodstains and the burn marks in white, an impact of incredible realism. The face, in negative, reveals a face of impressive majesty, with eyes shut in death. The shroud acts as a photographic negative, which becomes positive when the camera inverts the chiaroscuro, the perspective shading. To obtain a photograph, you need light. On this basis, we can serenely believe that in the darkness of the sepulchre, a light must have been released from the covered body. There is no other explanation. The shroud is therefore a manifestation of light. Surprisingly, we can see that the face is not lit up either from the right nor the left, nor from the front or the back. It is itself a font of light lit up from the inside. The word photography means writing with light, a sign made by light. This is what photography is. An A.
Se è visibile l'impronta di un corpo umano. E la domanda più ricorrente è se...
On the shroud, there is a visible imprint of a human body, and the most penetrating question is whether the man on the shroud that has left this image could be Jesus of Nazareth. That is, the historical figure who lived some 2,000 years ago. You can use a formula of probability to try to answer these questions in scientific terms. We have two testimonies of a passion, torture, and death on a cross. The man of the shroud, of whom we have visual evidence, and Jesus of Nazareth, of whom we have written evidence. Can they really be the same man? There are many features common to both the man of the shroud and Jesus of Nazareth, but there are at least 7 which we could consider the most important. One can try to assess the probability of whether or not these features could have been characteristics of any other crucified man in history. For example, consider the fact that he was crucified with nails instead of ropes, which was also quite common, or having had a thorny covering on his head, which caused wounds visible on the shroud, or who has carried on his shoulders a horizontal crossbar, or having had a very rare funeral shroud, bearing in mind that those sentenced to crucifixion were guilty of crimes and were not Roman citizens, thus belonging to the lower classes of the population. The fact that this cloth remained there for less than 50 hours, because otherwise the putrefaction of the corpse would have cancelled the image, the fact that the corpse has not been washed, as was the case for a regular burial, but instead this has been delayed and postponed a second time, and so on, giving to each of these characteristics a probability value that could relate it to any crucifixion in history, and taking into account that these features are independent of each other, they do not influence one another, we find the overall result, that is, the probability that these features are present on the same crucified person, is the product of individual probabilities. A calculation done with a significantly wide margin of error, that is, giving the highest possible odds so as to avoid making mistakes, you get a final result in the order of 1 to 200 billion. How can you interpret this number? Simply by saying that if in human history there have been 200 billion crucified persons, only one could have on themselves all the characteristics examined. It's obvious that it's very unlikely that in human history there have been this many crucifixions, especially if we consider that crucifixion lasted only for about a millennium, from mid-first millennium BC until the first half of the first millennium AD, and used above all in Roman times. Just to have a correct idea of the magnitude, in the Roman Empire there were 60 million inhabitants at the time of its greatest extension, and one cannot think that they were all crucified, else they would have vanished. You can presume that there have been millions, maybe even tens of millions of crucifixions in history, but no more. Therefore, we may conclude that there is a very high probability that the man of the shroud and Jesus of Nazareth are the same person, at least according to the data provided by history, archaeology, and direct examination of the shroud. If in the future this data changes, this calculation can be modified and updated, keeping in mind that with such a vast probability, in order to change the outcome, what would be needed is a radical change in knowledge about Roman crucifixion, which seems somewhat unlikely.